Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Leon Wessels, and I will be the moderator for today's session. I hope everyone had a fantastic Memorial Day weekend. I know it was awesome just to get outside and enjoy the weather, and I trust that everyone felt the same as we did here in northern Minnesota. I'm pleased to have Judith Pearson join us as our presenter today. I will be introducing Judy in just a few minutes. On behalf of ITM 21st and Life Insurance Trust Company and my associates, John Barkhurst, Joe Gaustad, and Aaron Hansen, we want to thank you for attending today's session. We welcome and appreciate your feedback. I also want to thank the Michigan, North Dakota, Iowa, and other state trust and banking associations who have promoted our webinars to their members. Today's session is the third webinar since the restart of ITM 21st University Education Opportunities. If you find that your time is well spent and the information helpful, please share your experience with your friends and colleagues, as we want as many people to participate as possible. And it seems to be working. Our numbers are growing every week, and so we thank you for sharing that information with others. If you are not already signed up to receive our weekly blog, you can do so at the ITM 21st website. I believe that you will find the information timely and useful. We are going to use the GoToWebinar platform again for our sessions. Each of these will be recorded and available on the ITM 21st website under the Education tab. The phone lines will be muted except for those who are listed as panelists. I encourage you to ask questions via the questions or the chat box that is on your screen, and we have allocated time at the end of the session to answer any such questions. Please help make this interactive by submitting yours. If you have a question that you do not want addressed openly, please indicate this when you submit it, and we will respond to you privately. Slide 2, our continuing education, what credits and how to get them. All of our sessions are free of charge, even for those seeking CEC credit. All webinars are submitted for 1 hour of CTFA and CFP continuing ed. For those of you who are members of Fiduciary Investment Risk Management Association, better known as FIRMA, you may also receive credit for today's session. To receive your continuing ed credits, please click to download the form from the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. That should be on the screen where you see there'll be a handout section there. There's 2 download possibilities. It says handouts 2. If you go in there, you should be able to download that PDF. If you have problems locating that or downloading it, you can go to our website and get the form there as well. Once you complete the form, please return it to the ITM21U at itm21st.com within 7 days. If you have questions about the credits or having any issues, please send an email to that same address and someone will respond to you as soon as possible. Slide 3, our faculty with John Barkhurst, Aaron Hansen, both of ITM 21st, Michael Brohan with Your Life Insurance Solutions, Judith Pearson with Nomadic Solutions, and we will also feature guest speakers, which will happen to be in 2 webinars from now, will be Lloyd Poole and Kevin Maas from Poole Consulting. And we also expect to have Rachel Green from Team Risk Management on a future session, hopefully in July. The webinar schedule on slide 4, June 10th, is a Trustee's Guide to Life Settlements. That'll be presented by Aaron Hansen and Michael Brohan. And then on June 24th, we'll have the Directed and Delegated Trust, The Risk of Confusing the Two. Again, that's presented by Kevin Maas with Poole Consulting and Training Group. Slide 5, The Winner's Minute by Matt Hammond. Ideas are like seeds, apparently insignificant when first held in the hands, but once firmly planted, they can grow and flower into almost anything at all. A cornstalk, a giant redwood, or a flight across the ocean. Whatever a person imagines can be achieved. These words came from Charles Lindbergh, who completed the first solo transatlantic flight 93 years ago. Lindbergh exemplifies the truth that your imagination has the power to create undeniable momentum in your life. Despite 34 hours of travel across the Atlantic, Lindbergh reached his goals and accomplished what others could not. Let his story push you to do the same. So with that, let's introduce our speaker today, Judith Pearson. Judith is a seasoned insurance industry and risk management expert and leads Nomadic Solutions as their president and CEO. Nomadics has an expertise in identifying, mitigating, and transferring risk for wealth transfer vehicles. Judith has been a frequent speaker and has been quoted in notable periodicals such as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, as well as the Financial Times, and has written articles for Wealth Management and Trust and Estates magazine. Judith was named one of the 2015 Power 100 Leaders in the Art World by Blue Art Info International for her role as an insurance innovator. I will say that Judith and her colleague Kelly have prepared an impressive slide presentation and handout materials today. Please join me in welcoming Judith Pearson as our featured speaker. Take it away, Judith.
Well, thank you, Leon, and everybody else who's created this ITM 21st University. It has been spectacular for the first couple, and I'm happy to be a part of this next one. Let me just get my presentation here. Okay, so the topic today is minimizing trustee liability in a changing market. And a changing market it is. So we'll be going through a lot of information about how we see the market. And Nomadic Solutions is a risk management company, and our focus is to help our clients first identify their risk and exposure. Second, what can we do to mitigate that risk before we even start talking about insurance solutions? And the third piece of it is, if we can't mitigate it, what can we do to transfer that risk through insurance? So generally, we work with our clients with three different levels, and that is how this presentation is being set up today. We've all heard the numbers about the historic amount of money being transferred intergenerationally over the next 30 years. That has created a ton of creativity from the financial professionals, but it's also created a lot of challenges for how we all do our job. And now we add COVID to this because of the financial uncertainty we have. The role of the trustee has never become more necessary, but more risky. And so the question is, what can we do today to help our families and the people they choose to help them with their legacy planning and transfer? Like I said, today we're going to talk first about the challenges that we see trustees facing. Second, how is the market responding to these changes? And finally, what is the component of a risk management program? The complex landscape of trust has been rich with opportunity and upside, but it is full of landmines and personal liability and risk. Litigation is increasing in frequency and severity. The laws are complex, contradictory, and constantly changing. The trust structures themselves are constantly changing, as well as our family structures as they evolve. Families are transferring more alternative asset classes, which has really made a shift between what used to be the large institutional trust companies, very comfortable managing the trust when there's marketable securities. But in today's world, where we have alternative asset classes, it's not as easy, and we've had to come up with different solutions so that everybody is comfortable with how we're going to manage through this wealth transfer. And finally, as a result of the new trust structures, more advisors are being asked to provide trust services. So never before has it been so difficult to navigate this risk. Let's focus on the litigation and why is it increasing in frequency and severity. The amount of wealth transfer that we're seeing, as we've already talked about, is really highlighting many of the issues. And as we've taught our next generation to ask more questions. That's created a situation for the beneficiaries to ask more questions and investigate their trust and the assets, and it's creating additional litigation. Financial instability is causing the beneficiaries to investigate the trust terms and question the investment. Society in general is becoming more litigious. And as alternative asset classes make up significant amounts of the portfolio, different expertise needs to be used to manage these trusts. There's an increase in the number of fiduciary litigators. I kind of call it my collision course. And one example would be, on an anecdotal basis, from a law firm perspective, about 50% of the law firms are now allowing their partners to serve in trust or fiduciary capacities. However, the other 50% of the law firms are saying, no, that's too risky. We're not comfortable with the exposure, and instead are creating fiduciary litigation departments. And that will be an interesting collision course as we move down the timeline. There's also a proliferation of new trust laws that we'll talk about later. And there's new roles that are evolving on every day. You know, even just looking at trust protectors, that started with the theory that it was a non-fiduciary role. However, we're seeing that role be expanded not only in what they're supposed to do, but how they're reporting. And that expansion is creating more opportunity for litigation. The default and mandatory rules under the UTC are just starting to be fleshed out, yet the UTC still is being adopted by many states in different formats. So creates a lot of confusion. And finally, the new trust structures like the asset protection laws are just starting to be tested. And in general, I think we're going to see more of that as we see the additional economic turmoil. So what concerns our constituency? And we use the word constituency because clients are varied. They're the families, they're the advisors, they're the trust companies. It means everybody who is involved in this wealth transfer market. So just kind of raising some of the issues that we've been thinking about and watching. You know, we've talked obviously a lot about the trust-owned life insurance, and Michael Brohan did a fantastic job at the last university. So I'm not going to go into any more detail other than we know that the life insurance policies are in turmoil. And unfortunately, while there's many great experts who are helping our families, there are a lot of challenges as we see different assumptions playing out in the policies. So trustees really need to make sure they understand what that means and get the expert advice. There have been a lot more distribution questions with this litigation, with this liquidity crunch in today's financial turmoil. Sometimes the trust documents will support the additional distributions that are being requested, but oftentimes they're not. And it puts a trustee oftentimes in a no-win situation. We also are seeing more interfamily loans. When done correctly, they can be very beneficial. However, if not documented appropriately, the assumptions made purposefully, and everybody understanding the issues, we can see big challenges coming forward. Investing and reporting, especially, again, I keep talking about the financial turmoil. Our decisions today are going to be looked at in hindsight, being 2020, and it's going to be very difficult. It's very difficult to know what to do appropriately. And the two things that we're watching on that is the SEC has come out with pretty clear guidelines to publicly traded companies on how they need to be reporting to their shareholders. While you may say to yourself, what does that have to do with trustees and beneficiaries? Anytime we see this kind of guidance, it always rolls downhill to other situations, whether it be private companies, and we're worried now about the trustees when they are reporting to their beneficiaries what the financial condition is of the trust. So we suggest that you really seek advice from the professionals when you're doing the reporting, or when you're getting or when the trustees are getting questioned by the beneficiaries. We are also seeing the institution of Reg BI, the best interest rules. Now, while most of us would suggest and think about it from an RIA's perspective, I do believe that these types of laws, because we've been seeing this push and pull about who's going to be regulating many of the professionals in the industry, that it behooves us all to be watching what that looks like and how it might be implicated to our trustee roles. Some of the cases that we're watching, I don't know how many of you have seen the Marie and Ed Bosarge case, which is a test between Texas and South Dakota privacy laws. The allegations are that Mr. Bosarge, during the marriage, transferred marital property to an asset protection trust in South Dakota. This is in litigation right now, and many of us are watching to see how the laws in South Dakota are going to hold up when we see what appears to be a challenging fact pattern. So watch that case to see what it's going to look like. And of course, it's only being tested in South Dakota, but it will give us insight into what's going to happen in other states. The other litigation we're watching, and this type of litigation has been going on for years between the banks and the RIAs and the other investment professionals, looking at what makes sense from internal versus external investments. But there are two recent cases that have been brought, at least the first one, the BNY Mellon case, which is testing the prudent investing of internal funds versus external funds. I believe this is at least the third time it's being tested. So we just watch it, because if it keeps getting tested, one day we may have a different decision. So we need to be very careful. And the other one is the Ambassador Advisors, which is a similar kind of conflict of interest allegation. It's just interesting to watch and to see if one of these days they're going to be tested differently under these different laws. The next thing that I want to talk about is the trust structures and how they're changing, and really looking at very quickly going from traditional trusts where one individual, the trustee, had the responsibility for administration, distribution, reporting, and investing. We are huge supporters of trustees hiring the professionals and delegating those responsibilities as the number one risk mitigation factor. However, as these roles and responsibilities are bifurcated in the new UTC type laws in South Dakota and what have you, in the directed trust environment, we're watching very closely. It's a made-up term that I've created called fiduciary service providers, because it depends on the trust document, the state laws, how it's interpreted. Is that individual a fiduciary? Are they not a fiduciary? What is it going to look like as we start testing these things? I was just talking with somebody the other day who in theory, was in a non-fiduciary role, but because of his experience, he took it upon himself to look more closely at how the investments are performing and the reporting that's going on and tracking some of the different decisions. And my comment to him was, that's all great. You're doing your job in the absolute diligence, but that may now create an easier testing of you being a fiduciary versus a non-fiduciary. So as we start looking at these laws and these structures, people need to be very careful about what it says. And I believe that these laws are going to be litigated significantly, and it will be interesting to see how it turns out. The other things that we're seeing is, as I've talked about already, new roles and responsibilities. I don't want to keep going over it, but one of the more recent discussions I've been seeing, I'd say from about 4 or 5 very highly placed individuals, a new term I've seen is called beneficiary advocate. What that role is really looking at is to provide checks and balances between the beneficiaries, the trustees, and obviously the grantors and settlers. That will be very interesting. And the reason why people are looking at this and advocating for this role is because of the unfortunate situations where there might have been, I hate to use the word abuse or misuse of the trust, but that's what's happened. And so beneficiaries who have felt that their trusts have been mismanaged are now suggesting to many that there should be this new role. So that's one to be really watching, and that will be back to the increasing potential litigation. Family offices, that is a term that there is no definition, and it's changing on a daily basis. And even whether it's a single family office or a multifamily office, the way we look at the roles and responsibilities, the risks of litigation, the structures are changing. And it is just incredibly important that everybody understands the inner workings when we're trying to create a risk management program. So we spend a lot of time with that. Also, we're seeing the advent again of private trust companies in the directed trust environment. Last I looked at South Dakota, there were over 50. Some of these are set up as a regulated entity. Sometimes people say, well, maybe to avoid some of the costs, we're not going to create it as a regulated entity. However, I want to caution that even if it's an unregulated entity, it needs to be operating as if it were regulated. There are process and procedures, there's professional governance, it's important to be talking about the next generation family involvement. And so just want to be watching and thinking diligently about how we can keep these extraordinary type structures in place. Family structures are changing. We've talked about the divorces, and the traditional two-parent is changing, which sometimes affects how the laws are created. And so it's just as this is an ever-changing world, we have to make sure that the trustees and the trusts are being structured so with the idea of what this means, so that decision making can be more clear. And I've already talked about when we have alternative asset classes, each one has its own expertise. I want to give an example of a cross-trusteeship that I was working on with a family. It was 2 guys who got together 35 years ago, and as you've never heard this situation before, they trust each other more than brothers. The next generation has grown up together. everybody loves each other, there are no issues, and because they understand each other's families so closely, they felt it was best to have one family being the trustee of the other family. However, all of the advisors could see the potential challenges going on, and they couldn't quite get the grantor to kind of believe what they were saying in terms of potential litigation and things like that. So we were brought in not because we saw things differently, but we had a different way of presenting it to the wealth owner. And basically, we set up a graph that showed if the grantor didn't step out of some of the control mechanisms, there is a likelihood that the IRS may put all the assets back into in his estate, which would have kind of annihilated all the planning that they did. We also walked them through that they really needed to make sure that the trustees were making the decisions, were communicating it to the appropriate people. Otherwise, there could be litigation there, again, from the IRS and others. And finally, they had one of the family members that was working for the company, but acting as a de facto distribution agent. And that person, when they're acting as a distribution agent for the trust, is not acting as an employee for the company. So we help them understand, in order to protect that individual, that they should form an LLC so that they could put in control mechanisms. That's just one example of when you have this family business involved, multiple generations, different asset classes on how it needs to be. We really need to work with our clients very carefully. I have a lot of background in the art market, and I just want to give one example of, again, how managing art is so very different than managing other assets if you're not involved in the industry. I was contacted by a trust company who had said that they'd settled an estate of one of the family members, and they had one work of art that was of value. They went to one of the auction houses for an appraisal, and the auction market appraised it for $2.5 million. However, when that work of art went in front of the art panel of the IRS said, no, we believe that painting is worth $7.5 million. The challenge now is we have an estate that's closed with a big potential tax ramification and perhaps an allegation of negligence for the type of appraisal that they got. We were able to set them up with an appraiser that's very experienced in arguing with the IRS, and they were able to settle the situation before litigation ensued. But if you're not involved in the art market, you wouldn't know how challenging these different kinds of appraisals could be. So those are the challenges. So now I want to talk a little bit about how is the market responding to these changes. We've discussed already that new players are coming into the market willing to serve as trustee in the nicest of all ways, or perhaps being pressured to serve as trustees. So we are seeing lawyers, CPAs, RIAs, life insurance people stepping into these roles. The real challenge is each one of these professionals has an expertise that's important to serving in the trustee role. However, they may not have the expertise on other pieces. I'm not wanting to pick on lawyers, but it's kind of the easy one, because lawyers, when they are setting up the wealth transfer vehicles, develop a very close relationship with the wealth creators. And over years, there's a comfort level from the wealth creator or the wealth owner that the lawyers are there to protect their interests. However, when the trust is now funded and distributions are about to be made, the hat changes. It's not protecting anymore. It's the fiduciary relationship between the trustee and the beneficiary. And so there are new skill sets that may have to be learned in order to serve in that role. So we just really want to talk about each one of the professionals probably has different types of expertise that they either need to learn or delegate to somebody else as they manage through that trust. As people are thinking about what they should consider before they become a trustee, it's really important that the trustee reads the document and maps out the who, what, when, where, and how. Now, for institutional trust officers know this very clearly. However, many of the trustees that step into the role don't understand the enormity of their job and how to look at what might be some of the potential exposures. They also need to think about, could there be a conflict of interest when accepting the responsibility? And I don't mean necessarily from a legal perspective, but when you're very close friends with the wealth creator and have listened over the years to the challenges they might have had with some of the beneficiaries, they have to take that hat off and relearn that relationship and recreate that relationship. You have to make sure also that you have the time to perform the enormity of the job. And almost always that's underestimated. And I can tell you from personal experience, where I was the trustee of my parents' very upper middle class trust, which meant there was not a lot of money in it, but there was a lot of challenge in administering it. And I did that long before I ever thought about getting into risk management for trustees. And I had one of those brothers who questioned every single decision I made, starting when I was 24 years old. We get lots of conversations about, or questions about compensation. How should that trustee be compensated? And the answer is, there's lots of litigation on what that should be, but also the states look at it differently, and the wealth creators look at it differently, and the beneficiaries look at it differently. So it's important to get those conversations out on the table early and often. And finally, when you think about how you can be protected as a trustee, before we even get to insurance, the indemnifications in the trust are important. It's also important to look at the state regulations, what can be indemnified. And when we were looking at how to make sure that the insurance policies work appropriately, and we'll get there later, we worked with some fiduciary litigators. And one in particular, I asked, so how do you, in the most technical terms, when you're going to bring a lawsuit, squeeze that trustee? And that particular fiduciary litigator, and it's a consistent message anyways, is they always allege situations that can't be indemnified, like gross negligence or intentional misconduct. Even if the party is innocent, if those allegations are there, the trust may not be able to advance funds to indemnify or provide a defense for that trustee. So it's important to really look at all pieces of it. And also, as we know, when we get into litigation, we can never know exactly what the judge is going to say. Before we actually get into the risk management piece of this, I do want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the property and casualty industry as a result of COVID, because it's going to impact how we look at insurance. According to a Bloomberg article, Lloyd's of London estimated that the industry is going to suffer about $203 billion of losses. Interestingly, only a little over half of that is going to come from actual litigation and paying of claims. The rest of it is losses from their investment portfolio. And again, as Michael Brohan discussed in the last presentation, how it affected life insurance companies, it has significant impact on the property casualty industry. We've also seen at least 6 class actions, if not more, trying to get the insurance company to cover claims that they didn't underwrite for. And those would be for event cancellation, business interruption, and certain general liability claims, which puts pressure on premiums and terms and conditions. Because if an underwriter doesn't anticipate covering a certain kind of claim, and then they have to, it throws their reserves off, which then in turn creates problems with how much capacity they have to provide insurance. And capacity is defined as the ratio between how much they have in reserves and how much they can write in insurance premium. We also saw shifts in business. So for example, I'm sure you've all read that the auto insurers were returning premiums because people were driving less and therefore reducing the exposure. But if premiums are going down, again, it's putting pressure on other types of insurance. Same thing with workers' comp. We were seeing less people working as our economy was shut down. However, the types of claims that were being brought were increasing significantly and changing. So it's a very difficult situation if premiums are based on revenues and number of employees working, yet claims are going up in an unanticipated fashion. It makes it increasingly difficult. Some of the lines that are affected more than others are directors and officers liability insurance, for example. Before COVID happened, we were already going into what's called a hard market, which is characterized by increasing premium and decreasing coverage. It's the first hard market this section of the industry has seen in over 20 years. Now with the market instability or the economic instability that COVID has brought upon, D&O claims are brought as a result of stock market volatility, SEC guidance and intervention. We talked about that earlier. Business bankruptcies creates more losses. And as a result, we are seeing significant increases in premiums. And we are encouraging everybody who might have a renewal to look at it earlier rather than later. Employment practices is going to be really interesting. As we see layoffs, there are going to be challenges on how those are affected. And on the reverse side, as we get the economy moving again, how are we going to safely bring our employees back into the market? How do we make decisions around employees that are nervous to come back? Those are going to be very complicated decisions. And in some ways, management of companies are going to be betwixt and between, because it's like a whack-a-mole. If you say certain employees don't have to come back because they're nervous, yet they get treated differently than other employees, it becomes violations of some of the laws. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this evolves. And finally, you may or may not have been reading, but the number of cyber attacks that have hit because of the work at home has increased substantially. And I don't know about you, but every day I see a new phishing expedition that I try so dearly not to click on. So the final section that we want to look at is risk management. And again, as we said in the beginning, risk management has three different components. The first is identifying the risk. The second is mitigating the risk. And the third is transferring it through insurance. We talked earlier about what is expected of a trustee and what are the roles and responsibility. Now, our trustees may understand this, but the underwriters for the underwriting companies may not. And if it's not really clear what the roles and responsibilities are, it becomes very hard to implement the right risk management program. Also, what the underwriters are looking at, and it's important for the trustees to understand, is all their duties that are not so clearly outlined on how you solve the challenge, like duty of confidentiality. There is a duty of confidentiality, but with some of these new quiet trusts, we're starting to see some litigation whether those are appropriate or not. And so you have the duty to follow the trust documents, and you have duties to the beneficiaries. Obviously, to deal impartially with the beneficiaries, and also with regard to your own personal interest, and depending on what role and how the relationship evolved, that may be easier or more complicated. We're also starting to see litigation around whether, if there's a provision like a no contest provision within the trust, how that has to be managed, and litigation around what actually that means and how to manage through some of the decisions. So a lot to be looking at from that perspective. So how can we protect our trustees from a mitigation perspective? Well, first and foremost, it's an education of both the trustees and the beneficiaries. Because the new roles of these professional trustees are evolving, there are a number of organizations out there who are really trying to help continue that professionalization and the accreditation. So if any of you are individual or professional trustees, you might want to look at things like the Independent Trustee Alliance, or there's a marketplace, so to speak, called Trustee 21, which is putting trustees together with wealth owners and trying to help find independent trustees. There's the California Association. So there are resources that are getting better and more robust for the trustee. I think it's important really also to educate the beneficiaries, not in terms of things that are confidential, but helping our beneficiaries understand what is a trust and what was the trust structured for, and what is the legacy piece, and simple things like who do you call. In a directed trust environment, that's more complicated, and oftentimes we know litigation starts because of frustration, not because there is a real breach of duty. So if you have a trustee or a beneficiary, who calls, for example, a lawyer to get some advice, and they say, well, that's not really my role in this particular trust, call so-and-so. And then they call so-and-so and they say, no, I'm trying to be helpful, but it's not really my role. You've got to call so-and-so. By the time that they get to that third call, there's frustration and potential litigation. So anything we can do to really educate our beneficiaries on the structure and who to call to avoid some of that frustration is going to be helpful. We also are getting lots of questions around beneficiaries who are trying to find their voice within the family. And that really gets with, hiring some of the family dynamics people that can really help solve some of this. Also, we see a lot of use of LLC wrappers to put a barrier between the individual trustees and the beneficiaries in litigation. As we look at the litigation over that, the decisions are all over the board, whether the beneficiaries can pierce, I call it the corporate veil, but the LLC veil of protection. So I would caution anybody who's relying just on the LLC type laws. The final piece is insurance. And I just want to go through some topics so you can understand what the insurance looks like. So what is trustee insurance? It is a subset of professional liability similar to directors and officers liability, where the trustees are being insured for the professional services they are performing, generally for a fee. There's always questions about who pays for it. We sometimes see the trust being able to pay for it. Sometimes we see the trustee having to pay for it. And oftentimes, if the trustee has to pay for it, they will increase the fee to cover the insurance. So what does the insurance actually cover? It's intended to cover claims for alleged wrongful acts while carrying out the trustee duties. It's important to make sure, and almost all policies do provide, not only defense costs, but damages. Other insurance to be considered is cyber liability, D&O and E&O, depending on the structure, and crime policies, depending on what role and responsibility the trustee has. In structuring the insurance, it's really important to understand there is no one answer, and unless the people structuring the insurance policies understand truly the structure of the family office, the investment vehicles, the trust, what have you, it's very confusing what type of policy you put in place. It's not just simply trustee liability. Sometimes you want to make sure that the institution is protected as well. And I don't mean just the trust company, but also the family office or whatever, the investment vehicles are covered. We see a lot of misinformation about if you are working for a professional service organization, like a law firm, CPA, what have you, oftentimes they think they're covered by the firm's professional liability policy. It's really important to check into that and really understand the roles and responsibilities, because we believe often there's a lot of exclusions that apply, even if it says you're covered as a trustee. What about co-trustees that don't have insurance? And this really is important for the institutional trustees that are on the line or on this call. While the institutional trustees have insurance, if a co-trustee does not, and there's joint and several liability, and when a claim comes in, almost always the defense is bifurcated. If that co-trustee is out on their own, they don't know who to go to for a really good defense. They don't have the money for really good lawyers. They may create really bad fact patterns for the institution. So no matter what kind of structure you have, it's really important to make sure all fiduciary service providers are covered. And then the other thing is that I want to point out is, are the programs compliant? And what we mean by that, it's easier to look at some of the directed trust environments. South Dakota, Nevada, Wyoming, Alaska, all of those states require quote unquote D&O and E&O insurance. The first thing that we see is often those policies are not broad enough to cover all the services that the trust companies are providing. Secondly, some of the laws I've looked at, even as 35 years plus experience in the insurance industry, I look at the language and I'm like, I don't even know what they're requesting from an insurance perspective. So it's important to not only look at the laws to make sure that you have the policies and insurance you're supposed to have, but then looking at your own policies and not just checking off the box. Some of the things that need to be looked at that can be really tricky is the insuring agreement, looking at some of the standard exclusions. Like one of the things I talked about earlier is sometimes there are allegations of intentional misconduct or gross negligence. Some policies are better than others at defending until final adjudication of an innocent party. One of the things to look at is oftentimes prior acts might not be covered, yet a new fiduciary or trustee might be taking on the liability of prior fiduciaries. And making sure you understand what a claim means, because that gets to the timing of what policy might apply and what actual expenses are covered, and also what professional services are covered. The bottom line is no one policy fits all needs, and they need to be scrutinized to make sure that everything is correct. I think I kind of addressed a lot of these. We just love the line, are you the cobbler that has no shoes? All of us have our own expertise. All of us know how to protect our clients. But when it comes to ourselves, we're not always as good at looking at all of the details. Very quickly, because we don't have that much time and I want to have time for questions, I just wanted to, again, make sure everybody looks at the director trust environment to make sure that there's a complete insurance program. We've really talked about the private trust companies, but a lot of times the insurance underwriters might put on a regulatory exclusion, and then these things are going to get tested. So there's a lot of different things that are going on to make sure that they are covered. And I threw in ESOPs as a last minute because we're starting to see a lot of claims from an ESOP perspective, and we're seeing institutions not wanting to serve as a ESOP trustee and shifting that liability over to individuals at a time when the Department of Labor are really questioning lots of valuations and the structures and the leverage of the ESOPs. So just kind of in case some of you guys are looking for some solutions from that perspective, just kind of throw that out. So we've discussed the challenges for trustees, how the market is responding, and the components of risk management. And I recognize that there's a lot of complex, contradictory terms that we've discussed. So if you're not confused, you're not paying attention. So we ask you to be proactive when working with your experts to make sure you can navigate the risk, protect your assets, and have peace of mind when serving in this extraordinary role. With that, I think we have not quite 10 minutes for questions.
Great job, Judy. And I am confused, and I did pay attention. So I guess Tom is right. One of the questions that I have is, when you're trying to insure the risk, does it, I mean, as your underwriters look at, they're looking at the assets, the value of the assets? Are they looking at the number of employees? I mean, can you just maybe touch on some of the things that an underwriter is going to look at?
Yeah, so the rating typically is based on the revenue of the fiduciary, the assets, I'll call it under management, but not exactly assets under management, but the assets in the portfolio, the underlying assets. So marketable securities are going to be rated different than a family business. One of the things that, we're trying to get them to really look at more succinctly is the number one risk management technique is to hire the experts, whether it be a trust company, the lawyers, the CPAs, the investment advisors. And so we're encouraging them to look at each one of the advisors that have delegated responsibility, because the more professional, the less risk of certain types of claims.
Interesting. Yeah, I know it's such a broad spectrum of assets that are out there that fiduciaries are, have a duty or responsibility for. And, while we clearly are focused on the life insurance part in our business, my wife, for example, her company deals with several of the other unique and hard to value assets, whether it be oil and gas or real estate, farms and ranches and minerals, et cetera. And to understand, the exposure or the potential, downside or the risk associated with, as it's clearly stated, unique and hard to value assets has got to be, a tall order for an underwriter to really wrap their arms around. But it's great to hear that there are people out there focused on this, and I would assume that you are at the forefront of this effort, and that you are certainly a leading expert in this area. But I don't have any other questions at this time. If there's anything that you wanted to provide in a quick wrap up, or we can wrap up the session. So we got a couple minutes. It's your choice, Judy.
No, anybody who has any questions can, reach either the ITM 21 people or us directly. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have in any of the three categories. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I know we all have a ton of Zoom calls and webinars that we're dealing with, and I appreciate your attention for this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. And again, for those that are interested, we'll have another session on June 10th. Be sure to get registered if you have time available. And with that, if you have attended today's session in full and you would like credit, whether it be CFP, CTFA, or affirmative credit, please get us those forms and we'll make sure that those are reported properly. So with that, we'll sign off and hope to see you all plus some in a couple weeks. Bye-bye.